real for a long time, and because I'm an existentialist, I'm operating under the presupposition that you can tell what people believe by watching how they act. I don't care what they say, I don't care what their statements are about their view of reality, because the relationship between that and their actual actions is certainly not perfect, and sometimes doesn't even exist. One thing I've noticed is that no one argues with their own pain. Everyone who hurts acts as if they believe that pain is real. So we could say the ultimate reality is pain. That's how people act. It's in keeping with the claims of many religious traditions. The Jews are always recollecting past pain. I mean, the Christian God is a crucified person. I mean, there's a fair bit of pain there. For the Buddhists, the fundamental maxim is that life is suffering, and it seems to me that there's a metaphysical claim there. And the metaphysical claim is that pain is real. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by real, but people act as if their pain is real, so that's a good place to start. Now, that poses a problem. Life is a pain. Life is suffering, let's say. And why is that? Well, it's because you can be broken, hurt, and destroyed. And so that seems pretty self-evident. And worse, you know it. And that makes people unique. Like, that's our self-consciousness, right? That's really what separates us in some sense from other creatures. I mean, other creatures have some self-consciousness, like a chimp can learn to recognize itself in a mirror, and so can a dolphin, but that's pretty bare bones self-consciousness. Real self-consciousness is the knowledge of your borders, and not only in space but in time. And as far as I can tell, human beings are the only creatures that have discovered the future. And that's really good because we can plan for the future, but it's really bad because, the future's finite, and that's a big shock to the old system. And it's the existential burden that everyone bears, and it's associated integrally with suffering. And so then you think, well, life is suffering, and it's finite, and that's part of the suffering. That's part of what makes you question the value of existing, and maybe the value of existence itself. So then what do you have to use as a weapon against that? Well, we talked a little bit about responsibility. That seems to work. The amount of responsibility that you adopt in relationship to things seems to increase your meaningful engagement. And you might say, well, what's the most meaningfully engaged activity? And you might say, well, how about a little reduction in the old suffering? So you live your life so that you're not causing undue pain, especially pointless pain. That would be good, and maybe you could even be more useful than that, and you could figure out some ways that some suffering, yours, other people's, both, if you're really hitting a home run, maybe you can figure out some way that some of that could be rectified. And that seems to be meaningful in and of itself. I mean, if it's pain that makes you doubt the meaning of life, which is perfectly reasonable, then the cessation of pain, the cessation of suffering, the minimization of suffering, as a logical corollary, should be the proper medication. And so I would say that means that there's some mode that you can conduct yourself in that makes you a good person. And part of being a good person is to alleviate suffering. And I don't think you get to question that, actually. If the suffering itself is what's making you question the validity of your life, then you can't also say that the cessation of that is not useful. I mean, you can, but it's completely incoherent. You can claim incoherent things if you want. So then I would say these distilled stories that I'm talking about, the stories that are written, say, by great authors. I'm particularly fond of Dostoevsky, whose works are, he's head and shoulders above anyone I've ever read in terms of writers of fiction. He deals with the hardest questions that human beings face, and he has characters on both sides of the argument, and they really lay out the arguments. It's not like Dostoevsky, you know, he's got a belief, and so he has a character, and that character has his beliefs, and that character always wins the arguments. That doesn't happen in a Dostoevsky novel at all. He sets up a character, and then he sets up like 3 or 4 antagonists, and those antagonists, they're not straw men, they're like iron giants. They just stomp his protagonist, you know, and the whole thing is a war between these different conceptions of being, and it's amazing to see, it's amazing to read. So you distill these stories. Great authors distill stories. Great storytellers distill stories. And we have stories that are very, 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 very old. Those are usually religious stories of one form or another, but they can be fairy tales. Because fairy tales, some people have traced fairy tales back, you know, more than 10,000 years. And so they're part of an oral tradition. And oral traditions can last for tens of thousands of years. And you know, it's a story that's been told for 10,000 years is a funny kind of story. It's like people have remembered it and obviously modified it. It's like the game of telephone, you know, where I tell you something and you whisper it to the person next to you and so on. It's like a game of telephone that's gone on for, you know, 1,000 generations, and all that's left is what people remember. And maybe they remember what's important, because you tend to remember what's important. And it isn't necessarily the case that you know what the hell it means. You don't know what music means, but you know, that doesn't stop you from listening to it. You don't know, generally speaking, what a movie that you see or a book that you read means, not if it's profound. It means more than you can understand, because otherwise why read it? Well, so the idea is this, is that we're necessarily nested inside moral systems. The moral systems are predicated on narratives, narrative dramas of sorts, and the moral systems are what orient us in life. And the reason to understand them, to the degree that you can, is because you need to know how to live. Nietzsche said that if you had a why, you could bear any how, and that's good. One of the things that the Auschwitz guards used to do to the prisoners, and this is very telling, so at Auschwitz there was a sign that said, "Work will make you free." It was a little joke, not really a very funny joke. You know, it's the kind of joke that you have to be satanic, is the appropriate term to conceptualize, and to dare to state. So when the Auschwitz prisoners came to Auschwitz, you know, they were already pretty rough shape. They were in cattle cars. They'd been separated from their families. Everything had been taken from them. They were transported for a long time. They were standing up. The kids were suffocating because there was no room in the, you know, it was so packed in there. They didn't have anything to eat. There weren't any toilet facilities of any sort. It was like you got rid of 20% of the people just transporting them. You know, the ones on the outside of the cars, they froze to death because of course it was cold, and pretty nasty. And then when they got to Auschwitz, the guards used to have this game that they would play, and this is part of the work will set you free thing. They would get a prisoner, they'd take a prisoner who's already in pretty rough shape, and then have them carry a sack of wet salt, 100 pounds, from one side of the camp to the other. And you know, when you think of a camp, you think of something like a football field, you know, maybe something that big, fences around. It's like, no way, man, these were cities. These were There were tens of thousands of people in these places. So from one side of the camp compound to the other, that was a good hike. And that wasn't bad enough. They had to get them to carry it back and put it in the same place. Now, that's poetic in its malevolence. You know, what you're doing is you're harnessing the human compulsion to engage in useful activity and demonstrating how absolutely futile that is despite its difficulty. Seems like a bad thing to do. People need, it's a parody of meaninglessness, that's what that is. And you know, people need meaning in their lives because their lives are difficult. And so the question is, to what end should you devote your life? And another question might be, well, does it matter? Matter is an interesting word, because matter is matter, but matter is also what matters. And I would say that what matters is more real than matter. At least that's how you act. And then the question is, well, is there something you should be aiming at? It's a good question. That's the question of the meaning of life. And you know, one of the things that's supposed to happen when you come to university is that that's the sort of question that should be addressed. And as far as I can tell, and this might just be my more cynical side, what I see happening to university students, generally speaking, is that they come in clinging to the wreckage of their culture and floating with the pieces, and those pieces are taken away by professors who tell them that everything can be deconstructed and nothing has any real meaning. And it's like when you're finally educated, it's when you're floating out on the ocean and you've got nothing to stay afloat with. It's like, well, then you're done and you can graduate. And it's like, I don't see that as useful. Quite the contrary. So let me tell you a story. The first thing I'm going to propose to you, and we'll talk about this a lot, is that you inhabit a story. That the framework through which you look at the world is actually a story. And here's the story. The story is you're somewhere and you're going somewhere. And, you know, that can be conceptual or whatever. It's that, but there's a gradient between where you are and where you're aiming at, which means no more really than you're doing something while you're sitting there. And hypothetically, you're aiming for something better. And so you're in a state of insufficiency, always. The insufficiencies change, and then you're trying to rectify the insufficiency, and you presume that your current state is less preferable to the state that you're aiming at. And then the way that you bring those two together is sometimes you can do it through thinking, but fundamentally you do it through action. You do it through acting in the world. And so that's sort of the answer in some sense to the mind-body problem. You have a conceptual structure, but when you implement it, you're implementing it not abstractly, you're implementing it through action. And so that's the basic story. It's not a very interesting story, but it's the framework through which you view the world. So it's a value-laden framework. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to act and you wouldn't know what to look at. So it's a value-laden framework. You look at the world through a value-laden framework. So then we might say, well, what is the optimal value-laden framework? That's what we're going to try to figure out. Now, I told you about the war that went on between the communists and the West and how that obsessed me. And so one of the things that I really wondered about was, well, was this just an arbitrary thing? You know, like, did the communists, they had some axioms and we had some axioms, and if you're a moral relativist you might say, well, who's to say which set of axioms are better? Or even who's to claim that you could say that a set of axioms, one set is better than another? That's a moral relativist claim, and you know, fair enough. So I thought, well, maybe this is just an arbitrary thing and it's going to be settled by force, because that's how you settle an arbitrary claim between two competing systems where there's no room for negotiation.